He raised his hand 3 times. 3 times. The mayor's eyes swept right past him like he was invisible, like he didn't matter, like his 78 years of life, his decades of service, his sacrifice for this very town, meant absolutely nothing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the cramped community center as Harold Mitchell sat in the 3rd row, his weathered hand still raised, trembling slightly from age and frustration. Around him, younger voices dominated the discussion about the new shopping complex, their words sharp and entitled, their concerns about property values and traffic patterns drowning out any attempt he made to speak. The disrespect was suffocating. Here he was, a man who had bled for his country, who had watched friends die in foreign lands so these people could sit in air-conditioned comfort and argue about parking spaces, and they couldn't even acknowledge his presence. The mayor, a man, half his age with soft hands and a softer spine, continued fielding questions from the usual suspects. The real estate developers, the business owners, the soccer moms in their expensive SUVs. Harold's arm ached from holding it up, but he refused to lower it. He had something important to say about the impact on the senior community center, about the veterans who gathered there every Tuesday, about how this development would destroy the only place left where old soldiers could find fellowship. But apparently, his voice didn't matter anymore. Apparently, once you hit a certain age in America, you become background noise. A relic. Someone to be tolerated rather than heard. The irony burned in his chest like acid. He had spent 2 tours in Vietnam defending democracy, defending the very right of these people to gather and speak their minds, and now that same democracy was shutting him out. The mayor called on a 20-something blogger who wanted to discuss sustainable urban planning, and Harold finally lowered his hand, his shoulders sagging with the weight of invisibility. That's when the murmur started. A low, rippling whisper that began in the back rows and spread forward like a wave. Harold didn't turn around. He'd learned long ago not to expect much from crowds, but he felt the energy in the room shift. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. The mayor paused mid-sentence, his practiced politician's smile, faltering as he squinted toward the back of the room. The blogger's voice trailed off into uncertain silence. Even the developers stopped their whispered calculations and turned to look. Someone was standing. Not just standing, but rising with the kind of deliberate authority that commanded attention. Harold could feel the presence behind him, solid and unmistakable, like a general taking the field. The footsteps that followed were measured, purposeful, each one echoing in the suddenly silent room like a drumbeat. Expensive shoes on linoleum. The kind of shoes that walked the halls of power, that had stood on marble floors in Washington, D.C., that carried their owner into rooms where decisions that shaped nations were made. But he didn't know that someone, in the back row, had been watching every second. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, if you've ever been dismissed because of your age, if you believe that respect should be earned through service and sacrifice rather than status and wealth, then you need to hear what happened next. Hit that like button, because some stories need to be told and some heroes need to be remembered. Subscribe if you believe that honor doesn't have an expiration date. The man walking down the aisle wasn't just anyone. Senator Michael Rodriguez had been sitting quietly in the last row, having slipped in 20 minutes earlier to observe this town hall meeting in his home district. He made it a point to attend these local gatherings when his schedule allowed, believing that real governance happened at the grassroots level, where ordinary citizens voiced their concerns about potholes and zoning laws and school budgets. But tonight he had witnessed something that made his blood boil with righteous indignation. Rodriguez had served in the Marine Corps before entering politics, and he recognized the bearing of a fellow veteran from across a crowded room. The way Harold held himself despite his age, the way he'd raised his hand with military precision, the way he'd maintained his composure even as he was repeatedly ignored. These were the marks of a man who had served something greater than himself. And when the senator realized that this elderly veteran was being systematically dismissed, treated like a piece of furniture rather than a human being with valid concerns, something deep in his chest ignited with fury. He had watched Harold raise his hand the first time, seen the mayor's eyes slide past him toward a younger face. He had witnessed the second attempt, noticed how the moderator seemed to look through the old man, as if he were made of glass. By the third time, when Harold's weathered hand trembled in the air only to be ignored once again, Senator Rodriguez had seen enough. This wasn't just disrespect. This was a betrayal of everything America claimed to stand for. This was ageism in its ugliest form, wrapped in the casual cruelty of indifference. The senator knew about invisible veterans. He had served on the Veterans Affairs Committee for 8 years, had heard testimony from thousands of former servicemen and women who felt forgotten by the country they had sworn to protect. He had seen the statistics about veteran suicide rates, about homelessness, about the way society discarded its warriors once their usefulness had passed. But seeing it happen in real time, watching a man who had clearly given his best years to his country being treated like irrelevant background noise, struck him with devastating clarity. As Rodriguez moved down the aisle, his mind flashed to his own grandfather, Sergeant First Class Eduardo Rodriguez, who had stormed the beaches at Normandy and later spent his twilight years being shuffled from one VA waiting room to another, his stories of courage and sacrifice falling on deaf ears. His grandfather had died feeling like his service didn't matter, like his generation's sacrifices had been forgotten in the rush toward a future that had no time for old men with old wars and old wounds. The senator's footsteps echoed in the silence as he approached Harold's row. Every eye in the room followed his progress, confusion and curiosity written across dozens of faces. Who was this man? Why had he commanded such immediate attention? The mayor's face had gone pale, his political instincts finally kicking in as he realized that someone important had been in his audience all along, someone who had witnessed his casual dismissal of an elderly constituent. Harold still hadn't turned around. He sat with his hands folded in his lap now, resigned to another evening of being overlooked, another reminder that his generation was considered expendable. He stared straight ahead at the PowerPoint slide showing projected traffic patterns, his mind drifting to Tuesday mornings at the VFW post where he and a handful of other aging veterans would drink coffee that tasted like battery acid and remember, friends who would never grow old. The footsteps stopped directly behind him. Harold felt a presence, warm and solid, someone standing at attention in the aisle beside his chair. The room held its collective breath, waiting for whatever would happen next. Even the mayor had fallen silent, his prepared remarks forgotten, as he stared at the unexpected visitor who had just transformed his routine town hall meeting into something else entirely. What happened next would silence the entire room and restore faith in the idea that service and sacrifice still mean something in America. Senator Rodriguez didn't speak immediately. Instead, he moved to stand directly beside Harold's chair, his presence commanding and respectful. The old veteran finally turned to look up, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the senator's bearing, the American flag pin on his lapel, the unmistakable aura of authority that surrounded him like an invisible uniform. But more than that, Harold saw something in the younger man's eyes that he hadn't encountered in years: recognition, respect, and genuine anger on his behalf. "Excuse me, Mr. Mayor," the senator said, his voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system as he leaned toward the microphone. His tone was polite but edged with steel, the kind of controlled authority that comes from years of commanding attention in rooms full of powerful people. "Before we continue with this discussion, I believe this gentleman has been trying to address the council." The mayor's face flushed red as he realized his mistake. He fumbled with his papers, suddenly aware that his casual dismissal of an elderly constituent had been witnessed by someone who could end his political career with a single phone call. "Oh yes, of course, Senator Rodriguez, we were just about to call on—" "No," the senator interrupted gently but firmly. "He's been trying to speak for the past 15 minutes. I've been watching." The weight of those words settled over the room like a blanket of shame. Rodriguez turned to face Harold directly, and what he did next would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. The senator came to attention, not the casual straightening that politicians do for photo opportunities, but the genuine military bearing of a Marine acknowledging a fellow warrior. His heels clicked together, his shoulders squared, his spine straightened into a perfect line of respect. And then, In a voice that carried all the authority of his office and all the reverence of his military service, he spoke directly to Harold. "Sir," he said, the single word carrying more power than any speech he had ever given on the Senate floor. "The floor is yours, sir." The effect was immediate and electric. Harold's back straightened as if decades had fallen away from his shoulders. His eyes, which had been dulled by dismissal and resignation, suddenly blazed with renewed purpose. Around the room, people leaned forward in their chairs, finally seeing the elderly man in the third row not as an inconvenience to be overlooked, but as someone worthy of attention and respect. But the senator wasn't finished. As Harold prepared to speak, Rodriguez remained at attention beside him, a living symbol of the respect that should be accorded to all veterans, regardless of their age. The younger man's presence transformed the entire dynamic of the room, turning what had been a casual dismissal into a moment of profound recognition. "Ladies and gentlemen," Senator Rodriguez continued, his voice now addressing the entire assembly, "I want you to meet someone who deserves far better than he received here tonight." He placed his hand gently on Harold's shoulder, a gesture that managed to be both protective and honoring. "This is Harold Mitchell, and before I tell you why you should listen to every word he has to say, I want you to understand who is sitting in your community center tonight. If you believe that every veteran deserves to be heard, that age should bring respect rather than dismissal, that the men and women who served our country in uniform should never be treated as invisible, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like Harold's need to be told and heroes like him need to be remembered. This is why we share these powerful stories, because honor never goes out of style." Senator's voice carried a new intensity as he continued, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, ensuring that every person understood the gravity of what they were witnessing. Harold Mitchell served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. He was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor, the Purple Heart for Wounds, received in combat, and the Combat Infantryman Badge for engaging the enemy in ground combat. He returned home to a country that spat on him and called him a baby killer, but he never stopped serving his community. Harold's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he heard his service record recited with such dignity and respect. It had been decades since anyone had acknowledged his military service with anything other than uncomfortable silence or patronizing thank yous. The senator's words were returning something to him that he had thought was lost forever. His identity as a warrior, as someone who had answered his country's call when it mattered most. After his military service, Rodriguez continued, Harold spent 30 years as a high school history teacher right here in this district. He coached the wrestling team, mentored countless young people, and volunteered every weekend at the community center that your proposed development would displace. The same community center where he runs a program for isolated seniors, where veterans gather every Tuesday morning to share coffee and remember friends who never made it home. The room was absolutely silent now, the weight of Harold's contributions settling over the assembly like a heavy blanket of shame. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly aware that his casual dismissal of this elderly man had been witnessed by hundreds of his constituents and recorded for posterity. The developers in the front row looked down at their hands, unable to meet the steady gaze of the senator, who was systematically dismantling their assumption that older voices didn't matter. Rodriguez turned back to Harold, his expression softening from official authority to personal respect. "Sir, I believe you had something to say about the impact of this development on the senior community center. Everyone here is ready to listen now." Harold stood slowly, his movements deliberate and dignified. The cane he used for balance seemed less like a sign of weakness and more like a staff of authority as he prepared to address the room. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "Thank you, Senator," Harold said, nodding respectfully to the younger man who had restored his dignity with a single word. "I've been coming to these meetings for 12 years, and I've watched this community change. I've seen how easy it becomes to forget about the people who built this place, who fought for it, who gave their best years to make it safe for your children and grandchildren." His voice gained strength as he continued, decades of suppressed frustration and overlooked wisdom finally given voice. That community center you want to tear down isn't just a building. It's where Martha Henderson comes every day because her children live across the country and she hasn't heard from them in months. It's where Joe Kowalski gets his only hot meal 3 days a week because his Social Security doesn't stretch far, enough to cover both medicine and food. It's where a dozen of us who served in Vietnam meet every Tuesday, not to glorify war, but to remember friends who died so you could sit in this room and argue about traffic patterns. The power in his words was undeniable. This wasn't the rambling of a confused elderly man, as some had assumed. This was the testimony of someone who had lived through history, who had seen communities rise and fall, who understood the human cost of progress when it comes at the expense of compassion. His presence had been transformed from invisible to indispensable in the span of minutes, all because one man had chosen to see him as worthy of respect. "I'm not against development," Harold continued, his teacher's instincts taking over as he addressed the room with the same authority he had once used to command attention from restless teenagers. "I'm against forgetting who we are in the rush to become something else. I'm against a community that throws away its history and its heroes because they've gotten inconvenient with age." The senator remained standing beside him throughout his speech, a silent guardian, ensuring that Harold's words would be heard and respected. The symbolism was powerful and deliberate, a younger generation of leadership literally standing with the older generation, bridging the gap between those who had served and those who now held power. When Harold finished speaking, the applause began slowly, with the senator leading the way. But it built quickly, spreading through the room like a wave of recognition and shame and newfound respect. People were applauding not just Harold's words, but their own awakening to the fact that they had almost missed something precious, the wisdom that comes with age, the perspective that comes with service, the dignity that should be accorded to all who have given their best for others. The mayor, his face red with embarrassment and his political future suddenly uncertain, cleared his throat and addressed Harold directly. "Mr. Mitchell, we apologize for not recognizing you earlier. Your concerns about the community center will be given full consideration, and I'd like to invite you to join our planning committee to ensure that the needs of our senior citizens are properly addressed." But Harold's speech had done more than just secure a seat at the planning table. It had reminded everyone in that room that democracy works best when all voices are heard, when respect is given based on character rather than age, when the wisdom of experience is valued alongside the energy of youth. The proposed development would ultimately be modified to include expanded senior services, and Harold would become a regular and respected voice at city council meetings. Senator Rodriguez had accomplished something remarkable with his simple act of recognition. He had shown an entire community what leadership looked like, not the kind that seeks attention or credit, but the kind that lifts up others and ensures that every voice is heard. His intervention had transformed a moment of casual cruelty into a lesson about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of public service. As the meeting continued, Harold remained standing beside the senator, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, no longer forgotten. The two men, separated by decades in age, but united in their commitment to service, represented something powerful about America at its best. A place where honor is recognized, where sacrifice is remembered, and where standing up for what's right still matters. The transformation in the room was palpable. People who had never given Harold a second glance were now approaching him during the break, introducing themselves, asking about his service, listening to his stories with genuine interest. The real estate developers were huddled in urgent conversation, realizing that their plans would need to account for community needs they had never considered. The mayor was frantically taking notes, understanding that his political survival might depend on how well he addressed the concerns of constituents he had been ignoring. But perhaps the most significant change was in Harold himself. The resignation that had settled over him like a heavy coat was gone, replaced by renewed purpose and dignity. He stood taller, spoke with more confidence, and moved through the room with the bearing of someone who knew his worth and expected others to recognize it as well. The senator's simple act of calling him "Sir" had restored something essential to his identity, the knowledge that his service and sacrifice still mattered, that his voice still had value, that his presence still commanded respect. "This is What happens when we choose to see rather than overlook? When we choose to honor rather than dismiss? When we choose to recognize the heroes hiding in plain sight among us? Harold Mitchell had been in that room dozens of times before, but it took one man with the courage to stand up and say, "Sir," to remind everyone else that they were in the presence of someone who deserved their attention and respect. The story of what happened that night spread quickly through the district and beyond. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, then national media. The video of Senator Rodriguez standing at attention and calling Harold "Sir" went viral on social media, shared by millions of people who recognized the power of that simple moment of recognition. It became a symbol of how we should treat our veterans, our elders, and anyone who has served something greater than themselves. Harold Mitchell became something of a local celebrity, invited to speak at schools, honored at veterans events, and consulted on community issues affecting seniors. But more importantly, he became visible again, no longer a relic to be tolerated, but a resource to be valued. His Tuesday morning coffee gatherings at the community center grew from a handful of aging veterans to a thriving intergenerational program where young people came to hear stories of service and sacrifice, where history came alive through the voices of those who had lived it. The community center not only survived the development but was expanded and modernized, with Harold serving on the design committee to ensure it met the needs of all residents, regardless of age. The new facility included a veterans memorial wall, a seniors programs wing, and a community room dedicated to Harold Mitchell, a recognition of his decades of service, both in uniform and out. Senator Rodriguez and Harold maintained their friendship, with the younger man often seeking the Veterans Council on issues affecting seniors and veterans. Their relationship became a model for how different generations of public servants could work together, how respect could bridge the gap between youth and experience, how the best leaders are those who lift up others rather than seeking glory for themselves. The night that began with Harold being ignored and dismissed ended with him being recognized and honored. But the real victory wasn't just his, it was democracy's. It was a reminder that every voice matters, that every citizen deserves respect, that the price of freedom is not just paid by soldiers on foreign battlefields, but by communities that choose to value all their members, especially those who have given the most. In a world that often seems to worship youth and dismiss age, that treats experience as obsolete and wisdom as inconvenient, Harold's story stands as a powerful reminder that our elders carry within them the accumulated wisdom of lifetimes spent in service to others. They are living libraries of courage, repositories of lessons learned through trial and sacrifice, guardians of values that should never go out of style. The senator's gesture, standing at attention and calling Harold "Sir," lasted only a few seconds. But its impact will ripple through that community for generations. It reminded everyone present that respect is not something to be rationed, that dignity is not a privilege to be earned, and that the simple act of seeing someone as worthy of attention can transform not just their life, but the life of everyone who witnesses it. This is why we tell these stories. This is why we remember these moments. Because in a world that can sometimes seem devoid of honor and respect, there are still people willing to stand up and say "Sir" to those who have earned it through service and sacrifice. There are still leaders who understand that true power comes not from commanding attention, but from directing it toward those who deserve it most. Harold Mitchell went to that town hall meeting expecting to be ignored, dismissed, and forgotten. Instead, he found his voice restored, his dignity recognized, and his worth affirmed by a community that had almost lost sight of what really mattered. And all it took was one man with the courage to stand up and acknowledge a hero when he saw one. If this story moved you, if you believe that every veteran deserves recognition, if you think that age should bring respect rather than invisibility, then share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us about an elderly veteran in your life who deserves to be honored, because every Harold Mitchell, in every community across America, has stories worth hearing, wisdom worth preserving, and dignity worth defending.